I don't believe men were created to be pawns in someone else's game. I believe we were created to be steward kings. Men under authority, yes, but entrusted with real responsibility. Not perfect men, but disciplined ones. Men who rule themselves, serve God directly, and refuse to live in fear. This is king, not pawn. Look, everyone talks about leadership, right? But very few people actually carry it. We live in a time where leadership has largely been confused with visibility, influence, confidence, platform. But real leadership is none of those things by default. Real leadership is burden, it is consequence, it is accountability that does not disappear when the crowd turns away, because trust me, someday it will. And that is exactly why so few people actually want it. Okay, we have this whole tradosphere thing going on, the trad movement. I want to go ahead and address something here very directly. This movement talks endlessly about traditional values, gender roles, masculinity, order, and yet very little of it produces actual leaders. Why is it? I think it's because many of the loudest voices preach structure without actually submitting to it themselves. They speak about responsibility without carrying any relational, familial, or even moral weight. Okay, they can critique culture from the distance, from their ivory towers, right, while remaining insulated from the cost of leading real people. And I think we as men, we've been able to feel this difference. And I think most of us can feel it immediately when we're listening to somebody. Leadership is not just commentary alone, because commentary is easy. You can criticize the world without ever having to govern anything, right? You can talk about roles that are supposed to be had and whatever without sacrificing for anyone. You can sound decisive without being responsible for the actual outcomes. Real leadership is actually the opposite of that. Leadership is when your decisions affect people who didn't choose the situation and you stay anyway. I think you can always tell the difference between a man who talks about leadership and a man who actually carries it. One will speak fluently, the other will listen carefully. One reacts quickly, and the other makes deliberate moves. One enjoys the spotlight while the other accepts visibility as a cost, not as a reward. And when the pressure actually shows up, only one of them gets quieter instead of louder. I think volume has often been mistaken for strength these days because modern culture rewards noise. The loudest man in the room is often assumed to be the strongest, right? But volume is not always authority. In fact, I would go as far to say it's compensation. Men who actually lead, they don't need to dominate the conversation. They don't need to posture constantly, and they don't need to threaten anyone to prove their strength, because strength that must announce itself, well, really, that's just a deep-rooted insecurity now, isn't it? Jesus' leadership, when you look at him, he was never insecure. He was not passive, he was not harsh, and he was never performative. He set boundaries, he enforced consequences, and he corrected publicly when necessary. And when he did, he never did it to humiliate. He did it to protect the mission, and that's the distinction that matters. Here's where I think fake masculinity exposes itself. False leaders punish to hurt, they shame, they intimidate, they enjoy control. Real leaders enforce consequences to protect, protect the vulnerable, protect the mission, protect the integrity of the group. They don't necessarily enjoy it, they just accept it. There's a moment every leader faces where leniency may just be easier, where letting something slide, it preserved comfort, but clarity would cost approval. And in that moment, leadership reveals itself, not through rage, not through cruelty, but through a calm decision that says, this stops here. Even if no one applauds, order is at least restored. I think there's this other distortion that we need to work on rejecting as a culture. And that's the idea that masculine leadership is harsh, aggressive, emotionally calloused, always asserting power, because that's not leadership. That is literally unregulated insecurity. Because a man who needs to dominate has not actually mastered himself. And a man who's not mastered himself can't really be trusted with authority over others now, can he? Christ-like leadership is not soft, however, it is stable. Unlike these other fake leaders that we see, Christ didn't lead through chaos, he led through presence. People trusted him not because he was unpredictable, but because he was consistent, okay? He didn't change his standards just to win approval, and he didn't explode emotionally to establish any form of control. He was immovable, and immovable men create safety. Fake leaders always create losers, okay? So here's the key difference. False leadership, especially one we see today, is a zero sum. Someone's always losing. Someone must be crushed. Someone must submit. Christ-like leadership is generative. It raises capacity. It multiplies competence. Okay, it creates environments where people go stronger, not smaller. And as crazy as it sounds, even your opponents, even your enemies will benefit from clear, fair leadership. And that's what real authority is. I really think that at the end of the day, some of the most decisive leadership moments are the ones that happen in silence. No audience, no credit, just a man choosing responsibility when, frankly, nobody would probably blame him for avoiding it. Those moments, they never go viral, but they do build civilizations. I think in that fake tradosphere movement that I've been talking about, I think I know why it's easier talking about it than it is living it, okay? Because it really is easier to talk about submission, authority, masculine order. But it is so much harder to be patient when you're frustrated, to be firm without being cruel, and to be decisive without any form of ego involved, not to mention taking accountability when you're wrong. Because real leadership exposes the man himself. Again, I think that's why so many of them, they prefer ideology, because ideology keeps the spotlight off of their character. Real leadership does begin with a form of self-government. I think it's a non-negotiable. You could disagree with me, but that's what I think it is, because I think a man who cannot regulate his emotions, his appetites, his speech, his impulses, I think that would be the kind of man who would eventually rule through force, because he lacks internal order. And if you have any form of internal chaos, that will always spill outward. I think that's why young men, especially someone like myself, has become so hungry for this form of real leadership, because we're not rejecting leadership in and of itself. We're rejecting this hypocrisy that we've been seeing for our whole lives, some even longer than mine. We don't want louder voices. We want men who can bear the weight of things that need to be bore the weight of. Okay, we need men whose words match their lives, and Lord knows I'm trying to do the same. Men whose strength that they have, it creates a feeling of safety for those who are around you. Men whose authority produces growth in those around you. I think that that's what sons, especially sons of God, recognize instinctively. It looks like true masculine leadership, I think, looks like calmness under pressure, clarity without cruelty, and boundaries that are set up without being rageful. Also, having the strength to enforce consequences without humiliating somebody. Simply put, I guess I would call it strength without spectacle. It's a leadership that doesn't really need to win arguments, because instead it wins trust. And I was kind of, thinking about this steward king model that we've been talking about, right? A steward king understands something crucial. He does not own people, but he does recognize that he's responsible for them. He doesn't rule to elevate himself. He rules to raise what has been entrusted to him. And that applies to families, businesses, communities, nations, and yes, even enemies are treated justly under a true king. But this all does not happen for free. There is a cost, and it's a pretty heavy one. Okay? This kind of leadership will cost you approval. It will cost you comfort and ease and simplicity. but it produces something far more rare and valuable, in my opinion, because it will create men others can stand behind without fear. And I think that that's something that is amazing and something we should all aim for. At the end of the day, leadership is not loud, it's not cruel, it's not performative. Leadership is the willingness to carry the weight so that others don't have to collapse under it. Christ did not lead by domination, he led by truth, sacrifice, and authority under God. This is king, not pawn. Reject fake strength, reject empty tradition, reject domination disguised as masculinity. Please become the kind of man whose presence restores order and whose leadership raises everyone it touches. That is biblical, that is masculine, and that is the new standard I give to you.